Hi, I'm Jay with Real Street Performance. I'm here with Brett LaSala. Brett came on board at Real Street this year, and throughout that process kind of rejuvenated my interest in V8 engines. And here we have a Coyote 5-liter out of his Snot rocket Mustang. And this particular engine's been over 200 miles an hour in the quarter and a stack of 7-second time slips. So the engine was running when we pulled it out of the car. We're gonna take it apart, look through it, see how it's living. Him or I did not build this engine. This engine comes from Fast Forward Racing. Joe Irwin and his crew have a really good handle on these engines, and it's something that we're looking to help supply our customers moving forward. But this has kind of been a really neat vetting process. Joe and I have worked off and on together for about a decade because he used to work with some guys that I used to work with, and it's just kind of been a point of coming together. So long story short, this is a Coyote engine that was making around 2,000 horsepower with two 76mm turbos. It's a stock block and a stock crank. Joe's got a really good handle on the sleeving program and how they install, keeping everything very neutral so there's not a lot of distortion involved, and making an engine that lives well and makes a ton of power. So let's get it apart and see how it was living.
I've been working with Joe at Fast Forward probably for 4 to 5 years with engines for my car. Yeah. Basically started just with the standard rods and piston upgrade with the factory sleeves. But that stuff all kind of checks out around 1,000 horsepower. The factory sleeve just can't handle the power. And then we moved into the sleeve blocks.
They all break the same?
No, they don't all break the same. So the Gen 1 block, Coyote, which basically ran from 2011 to 2014, the rod was the weakest link in that block. Some people pushed them to 1,000, but they were really good to 700, 800 before they didn't really live long. So you can do a piston and rod and then get 1,000 horsepower out of the engine and be kind of at the limit of the sleeve. After 2015, basically the stock short blocks are really good to 900, almost 1,000 horsepower. So putting rods and pistons in them wasn't a big turn on to a lot of people because the stock stuff almost did the same thing. So really the next move is to go to the aftermarket sleeves in the factory block.
Did you work on any of the early Mod Ford stuff, or were you just Coyote?
No, yeah, I did. I had a Ford Lightning that had a 2-valve engine. I didn't get big into the high horsepower mod stuff a lot. It was more into motorcycles at that time, and then when the Coyote came out and saw what that platform was capable of, I was like, all right, we're getting back into the automotive high performance stuff. And so after 2015, the Gen 2 Coyote came into play till 2017. That was, like I said, a good engine to 900 horsepower or so, the factory components. 2018 started the Gen 3 Coyote, which is a DI port injection. And that uses a spray-in sleeve. It actually doesn't have a steel sleeve.
How do those live?
Liner. Same deal, about 900 to 1,000 on the stock stuff is kind of the end of the wall with it before the sleeves break or the stock rods break, because they're good to about the same power.
Right. And it's amazing. This is one of the, so there's more than one engine that at bottom dead center of the piston is down out of the bore, so it's like hanging out of the bore, and we can get a shot to show you, but there's a line across the skirt where the skirt coating is removed, and it's just printed where the piston's down out of the bore, and it just rolls over enough that it's basically cut and worn this off, and you can see there's some scuffing down at the bottom of the piston.
Yeah, and we've with Joe, and I say we, me and him, have been through a few revisions of the piston with Manley throughout the years. He uses my car as kind of a test bench because I race a lot. I push my car real hard. We run it a lot. And then, maybe a year and a half ago, when Jay started tuning my car, and I put the Motec on it, we were able then to have all of the data and consistent tuning available to us to see where the failure points were and compare them throughout. And the pistons were an issue at the beginning, and now they aren't.
Do you think that you guys were hurting pistons before because of tuning error, or do you think that the pistons weren't up to the task yet?
Honestly, I believe it was a combination of the two between the piston design and throughout the tuning. So maybe we were designing the piston to band-aid the tuning, and then as the tuning got better, we were at the piston we're at now, and now they just keep running.
That's cool. This, for the amount of oil pressure that this engine makes, the rod bearing looks pretty good. You know, because we've turned this thing
9,500.
Yeah, so that's a lot for a factory wet sump. See if all the uppers look equal. Yeah, these engines are a pretty big departure, because when I was doing mod Ford stuff, it was 2 valve, 4 valve, 3 valve, but they were it just wasn't the brightest days for the Ford modular engine. They weren't very powerful. They had a lot of parts. You know, they pumped oil up into the heads. The oil didn't get back down into the pan fast enough. I mean, some guys out there really went fast with them, but this is also before there were a lot of turbos and a lot of turbo kits. So, you know, it was pretty the dark ages of the modular Ford engine compared to what it is now.
I think that's why I didn't mess with them much at that time. I saw you could put a blower on it and make 400 horsepower, and it's like it's not enough to be doing all that messing around.
Oh yeah, I mean there was a lot of if you go back into #96 through 99 or whatever, that you'd turbocharge one or supercharge it, and it would make 500 or 600 horsepower. It was not an exciting time to have a turbo V8, whereas now these things just crank.
Oh yeah,
they crank out so much power.
They double the horsepower instantly as soon as you put boost to them. It's 800 horsepower, no problem, 10 pounds.
It looks like that skirt is pretty consistent. Did you guys have issues collapsing the skirts, or do they stay pretty round?
No, previously they were collapsing.
Okay.
And then they would tear scuff the side of the cylinder pretty bad.
Yeah, I noticed the scuffing wasn't too bad, but what's interesting about that, the collapsing, you could collapse them from rattling the engine, or from detonation, or you could collapse them from rocking them over. There's more than one way to get one to fold up. But these are pretty simple design. It's not a very heavy piston, which I'm sure helps in the rod bearing life. These blocks are all 6-bolt cap.
Yep, all the mains are basically the same design. The piston oil squirters changed design some throughout the years, but we've always ran them blocked off.
The cranks, this is a factory Ford crank?
Yep, factory Ford crank. So the Gen 1 cranks, people would run the Boss 302 cranks. It was a different part number. If you visually looked at the crank, they looked very similar, except the back rod journal looked like it had a little more material on the Boss crank. But then Gen 2 forward, they all look the same. They look like the Boss crank. So now you just order a Coyote crank pretty much for anything. The only difference between them is the bob weight for whatever rod that specific truck or car came with.
What is the cost on a stock crank now?
They've gone up a little. They're like $340 now, $340. They used to be like $200.
Having spent quite a long time with the 2JZ and dealing with, a relatively affordable engine that you could make a ton of power with, looking at this engine and knowing what it makes for power, and knowing that it's got fairly inexpensive, like what does a block cost from Ford?
$1,000 to $1,500.
So you have a very affordable engine. What's the worst thing about this engine?
Honestly, I'm pretty content with the factory block stuff right now. Everyone's like, oh, when are you gonna go bill it? When are you gonna go bill it? There's a billet Coyote block, but it doesn't allow for cooling passage, so it's race car only, and it's $10,000. But like, we haven't broke a factory block. The heads have stayed sealed up, and just keep moving forward with them.
I noticed on this engine there's a little bit of a couple cylinders look like they were starting to move some combustion. How many runs were on this engine?
This engine went in the car at the beginning of this year, 2021, and ran into very recently. If I count the logs, it had to have been 100 anyway. Like, we were at the track more than once a month or out racing somewhere.
Right.
And it was on high power the whole time.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting to have a car that you can race that often.
Yeah, like we changed the oil and put fuel in it and go back out.
Right on. What about the timing chain stuff? How does that work for you?
It's been good. Basically, we have the combination of heavy-duty secondaries, and I think a lot of that relies on how big of a camshaft and heavy of a valve spring you're running to put more pressure on the chains. But the system we have in there now has been okay with the billet guides for support, and then the primary chains are still factory. There isn't an aftermarket chain available for those. I did change those as a maintenance item just because I was worried about them stretching.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was really when you have the Motec on these engines, you have 4 cam sensors and you can look at all 4 cam positions. And it was pretty wacky to see what the cams were doing. You know, with a timing belt engine, a lot of that harmonics and noise gets muffled.
Yeah.
But with a chain, you know, you're looking at it, and it's pretty troubling, to say the least. But it seems to just keep on going.
Right.
You know?
I'm fine.
Yeah, exactly. It's just fine, right? What about cylinder heads? What cylinder heads are good? What cylinder heads do you stay away from?
So the cylinder heads kind of progressed with the generations of Coyote, just like everything else did. Basically, they just flow better throughout the years. The Gen 1 heads, you know, as the baseline, and then Gen 2, the valves were a little larger, almost 0.7 millimeters larger, and the runners flowed a little more. Architecture of the head were all the same as far as valve train and how they bolt out to the engine. Then when the GT350 Voodoo engine came out, that's when the cylinder heads started getting real good. They came from the factory as like a CNC port. The valves were taller to allow more lift, and they were almost 2 millimeters bigger than the standard Coyote valve.
2 millimeters bigger?
Yeah, like 1.5 millimeters. They're pretty large compared to the standard Coyote. They outflow like the CNC ported Gen 1 and Gen 2 head. It just stock, like as far as that goes. So. But there's a little trickery getting them onto the engine as far as you have to have a specific camshaft and a couple specific timing components to intertwine them, because the Voodoo is a different firing order, the GT350 engine.
Yeah, right, because they got that flat crank in those.
Right, but you can't just put Coyote cams in the heads because of the taller valve. The base circle's different on the cam. Okay. So you have to have a custom cam and Ford Racing sells a hybrid cam also. It's nothing too difficult. You just got to know that you have to do that stuff.
Huh. What's the biggest obstacle that you and Joe have overcome with this engine?
Man, it was just that short run of like a couple piston issues, and like we said, you know, tuning maybe the piston that it was, and that was it. Like it's been really good.
Did you guys were you guys burning pistons, collapsing pistons? What was the failure?
Collapsing pistons.
Okay. You know, that's for the way that it pulls out of the skirt, you know, that's a pretty special deal to try to overcome. The Vipers were like that too, where they get the piston really hanging out of the bore at bottom dead center. And it's kind of a game nobody wins, because as it changes direction,
it has to move.
Yeah, it's like getting stuffed. It's just getting stuffed back up the bore in a very aggressive fashion.
Right, and then if the piston got a little smaller from collapsing, that got worse because there was more movement, and then that's when it starts going up the cylinder.
Yep. It's a pretty nice looking crank. Doesn't have a lot of heavy metal in it.
No.
It looks like 2 slugs of Mallory to get it to balance out. A lot of oil drain back on these blocks. That's pretty nice.
And this particular engine has billet main caps, and the reason why we ended up running those is because I purchased this block and it didn't have main caps, and there wasn't. I had a couple set of factory main caps we put on there, but the circles were just way too far out of whack. Yeah. So we bought these, but they've proven to do really well. So
yeah, that you know, with the Toyotas, people just buy billet caps and that's that. But with some of the factory engines, if you can't get billet caps, you really need to be careful and get the caps that came off the block.
Right.
You can't just get caps from your buddy.
No, and that's what Joe told me when I brought him in block. I'm like, oh man, I got 3 sets of caps. And he's like, no, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. Well, not to say you couldn't get lucky.
Right.
But caps, you know, whether they be cam caps or main caps or rod caps, you generally don't want to be mixing those things up.
Yeah, and then it was one of those things like the billet caps are probably obviously better than the cast steel caps that came with it, so I wasn't opposed to putting them on there.
Yeah. Well, anything you can do to add rigidity to the bottom end. You know, in a deep skirt block like this, where the, I guess the term deep skirt would be where the oil pan rails are below the main cap. Putting a cap that is got side bolts and stuff like this, you can add a lot of integrity to an engine block that way. It's pretty nice stuff. All the desirable early racing engines, that's how they were all done, because it gave more support. What's the compression ratio on this engine?
So this engine is 10-to-1. It's a flat top piston, and factory compression ratio on the Coyote has got a decent sized dome to it, and it's about 11.5-to-1. And then when it moves up to Gen 3 and the direct injection engines, they're 12.5-to-1.
12.5-to-1. Wow. People put, well, that's a DI.
DI.
So you get away
yeah,
with
you get
more.
away with a DI, exactly. Before I was working with Joe and I was just putting pistons in them at home in the garage kind of deal. We put a 12.5-to-1 set of mouths in an engine. It didn't like that. It didn't last longer than a pass.
No, they, compression is the first heat source. You know, it's, you can compile it pretty quick, especially on gasoline. So this engine was only run on good fuel?
1 ethanol, yep, only ever ran on that.
Did you do any C16 or gasoline racing, or you went right to ethanol?
No, I went right to ethanol. Well, I had, in the motorcycle stuff, I ran some gasoline things like the MR12 and things, but not in any boosted things.
Right. Did your Lightning ever blow up?
Oh, yeah.
Man, I
Twice.
used to.
Twice.
Those things used to come in blown up. Oh, terrible.
Yeah, I just stopped flooring it for an extended period of time. The gear change, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's like you sound like telling your kids you're going uphill in the snow both ways when you talk about how good cars are nowadays. This stuff is really, really, really good. So how long have you been working with Joe?
Honestly, I don't remember. I have to look. It's been so long.
How long have you been working with me?
9 months? 8 months?
Almost
April?
made it a year.
It's been at least 4 years with Joe, without exaggerating it.
Right on. Right on.
And he's a good guy, and he's just always there for me whenever I need him as far as engine stuff. And his work is always top of the line. So never ventured out to even think about going to anyone else.
No, it's cool to listen to, you know, a guy my age, which in the engine machining is a younger guy. You know, a lot of these guys are really getting up there in age, and you listen to him talk and he understands the processes and how they must be done that you don't make a bad engine.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and actually I got introduced to him from Jim, and we kind of got him into the Coyote business because we begged him to do our engines, and he was doing like GTR and some 2J stuff at the time.
Right,
like,
right.
I don't really want to take on a new platform, and we're like, come on, you don't trust anyone else.
Yeah.
And then he started doing our engines, and now I think it's his main engine he's doing now.
Well, he cut his teeth with high level stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, engines that have to work extremely hard and have a very short lifespan if anything is not in order.
Yeah.
So when you know, it's like for me working with the engines I worked with early on, like you build 100 Subaru engines and you're just like, these things are delicate. You know, you have to be handled with a lot of care. And then when you get into engines that are more flexible with staying alive, you can build really good engines without doing a bunch of odd steps.
Yeah.
You know. But listening to him talk about the sleeving process and watching, you know, he shared some videos with me on how they do it there. Mm-hmm. They really, really have a good handle on that, because you don't want to be creating distortion.
There's not a lot of material there left between these things.
Right. Yeah, it's a delicate game. it's a delicate game, but you know, you start pushing sleeves into something without everything right, and you'll get cracking.
Yeah.
You'll get sleeves moving around in the engine. You know, like the drop sleeve term.
Oh yeah.
You know, all these things are problems that you'd hate to spend the money on an engine, get it all together, and have one of those problems happen to you, and then you have to go right back to this step where you're back down to a bare engine. You know, because even the time alone, you know, is very valuable. So even if the guy you're dealing with would fix it for free, you still have to be dealing with the downtime, which no one wins that game. So yeah, it's definitely an opportunity to deal with people that really have a good handle on the components, so you don't have to do stuff twice.
This engine did have an upgraded wrist pin with the DLC coating.
Yeah, yeah, it's a big difference when you get into that trend pin, because most pins are only surface hardened, where the hardening process only goes in the kind of the outside of the pin, whereas the trend pin is hardened all the way through. So it's a very, very strong part. It's what we use in the higher level super engines, and they live really well.
Yeah, it was hard at first to swallow it when the pin costs as much as the piston, but the fact that it's going to keep the piston alive and live twice as long, and they're essentially reusable on a refresh or something.
Yeah, it's a team effort between the piston and the pin, because they're both working together to keep shape as the cylinder pressures really increase. And for as light as this piston is, it lives really well. You can see a little bit of transfer on the outside of the pin and on the inside of the pin bore, but this combination, unlike the combination in the Super we run, there's a lot of room here, right. You know, which when you're dealing with a wet sump system, you don't have unlimited oil flow available. You're trying to balance the weight of the reciprocating parts and the strength of the reciprocating parts, because if you get a piston in here that's too heavy, it's harder on the bearing system. And if you get a piston in here that's too light, it's just gonna break sooner, you know, and they'll get cracks around the pin bores and things like that. But this is a pretty simple forging, and it lives well. Manley does a good job, because the way they do their processes too, between the first step to the last step, they do them in order to keep the ring lands really flat, which will help keep the piston sealing better. Were these pins reused, or these pins are new to this piston?
No, they were in one previous piston on a refresh.
Yeah, there's no real galling. If you look in here, you can see just a little bit where the pin is polishing the pin bore. That's kind of typical with the DLC, because the coating's really hard, and it mimics the pin surface. So it's more of a metal polisher than a metal galliner that a stock pin or an uncoated pin would be. It's funny, I never thought I would get back into Mustangs. Even the sound of them, just once I started working with the 2J, I was just not interested. And then since working with you and Jim, it's kind of fallen back into them. It's an interesting game.
Well, we're gonna Coyote swap your Fox body.
No, we're not gonna do that. No, not ever gonna do that. We're gonna Coyote swap a Fox to race an all motor. That's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, that does sound like fun.
Yeah. Wow, it's pretty light. What does the thing weigh, like 45, 50 pounds?
Stock.
Huh. That's pretty cool. You know, the Mod Ford has always had all the Cobra versions and whatnot, the steel cranks were always nice and inexpensive.
I think this crank's actually very similar to all the mod motor cranks.
Yeah, it looks like it. This process here where they they roll this down.
Yeah.
This is an OEM process. The aftermarket cranks get into big radiuses, and this they just like steamroller all that material like down together to get it all compacted. It looks like the crank keeps shape pretty well. There's not really any abnormal wear.
One worn more than the other or something.
Well, just, you know, when you get into like crank whip, you'll have, like on the JZs at high horsepower, you'll see touches like this.
Okay.
Where it'll be opposing because the crank's starting to oscillate.
Yeah.
The billet cranks help solve some of that. So there's a little bit of chatter in the mains through the centers.
Is that the coloration compared to the?
Yeah, see how this is the
like
cleanest one, right? This is just a machined saddle. And then here you can see there's chatter where the cap's vibrating on the block. You could look at this and you could say, oh my God. Or you could look at this and say,
well, it's been ran for a year at 2,000 horsepower. Right. Like it's doing pretty good.
Yeah, this is totally acceptable.
For a factory component.
Yeah. Well, even for a racing component, you know, you could get into, the racing block thing was not without fault. I mean, there was a lot of racing blocks that were made over the years that had problems that were difficult to solve or unsolvable. And as those companies and part numbers became obsolete, the people that owned them just had to deal with them. I mean, you could buy, in the early days of, you know, aluminum casting heads and things like that, you could buy a set of aluminum heads and 2 years later they start leaking water and the place is out of business. It wasn't, you know, nearly as easy as it is now. It's really interesting that this engine scuffs as little as it does for how much that piston is out of the bore.
Yeah, it comes out of there a long way.
Yeah. This cylinder, I'd say, is the worst of the bunch as far as any scuffing goes.
And remember that plug had that little color on it, like it might have had a little water in it or something.
Yeah, which wouldn't have been helping because this insert came out. There's a combustion trace, and then this insert had come out. Now the newer blocks don't have this.
No, the factory casting, it's built into the factory casting.
Okay.
Like it's supported in the center to keep the deck straighter.
So is this an aftermarket component?
Yes.
Okay, so this is kind of like how the Honda guys do like a cylinder support.
Yeah, and I had talked Joe into doing this on this block, and he did it, and we honestly don't know if it actually helped it or didn't help it any, because we ran plenty of blocks without them. Yeah. And didn't have an issue either way.
Right on. So all in all, you have a pretty neat engine. There's nothing really alarming in it. The bearings look good. The thrust bearing looks good. You know, this car's a torque converter, so some converter packages will be hard on thrust bearings. So this is not one of those cases. Really, really neat example of factory components. You know, you have a stock block and a stock crank, and you have aftermarket pistons and rods and good machine work, good assembly, and you have an engine that's living well at 2,000 horsepower, which is, you know, you do the math. It's what's the car weigh?
3450.
Yeah, so you take that math, plug it into a 200 mile per hour trap speed at the quarter mile, you've got a 2,000 horsepower engine. You're tuning it well, you're running it on good fuel, and this is the outcome. And that's pretty awesome, because for me in my position and what I'm into, you know, getting a relationship going with a place like Fast Forward, it's kind of a shortcut. You know, it gets me right to the good stuff. I don't have to go through the process of learning and developing another engine program, because the JZ stuff is kind of like my mainstay, and it's where I want to stay. You know, I want to sprinkle a little Honda in, but I don't have a lot of drive to learn a whole nother engine. So having Brett here at Real Street, having access to Fast Forward is just another good thing that we can offer our customers, where they can have what he has, and that's the ability to go racing. So anything you want to add?
Just the confidence that having an engine like this gives us when we go race the car, just knowing that it can live at 2,000 horsepower. If we want to add more, we add more and just watch the data and see how it goes. And then knowing that we can sell this engine to a customer who maybe is making 1,600 horsepower. If it's living this well at 2,000, like it's like a 100,000 mile motor at 1,600 horsepower.
Not a 100,000 mile motor. Anyway, awesome engine and a good group of guys to deal with. So hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions about a Coyote engine, give us a call. It's something we will be moving into and offering the client base.